On the evening of August the 4th, in the year 1962, the city of Los Angeles seemed to breathe with its usual restless sighs. Cars moved along Sunset Boulevard, laughter spilled from bars and theaters, and behind the guarded gates of Brentwood, a telephone rang unanswered in a small white house. Beyond its closed door lay the most luminous figure Hollywood had ever known, her light extinguished as suddenly as a candle set down in a draft. That night did not only end a life, it marked the passing of an age, for with her went an innocence that would never be restored. Dear listener, welcome to this slow journey through memory and silence. Tell me, where and when do you rest as these words reach you? Perhaps by a warm lamp in the evening, or in the quiet of dawn before the birds call. Share your moment in the space below, for we are many across the world, bound together by curiosity and remembrance. And if you wish to walk further along these paths of time, subscribe and remain within this circle, so that the voices of history will never fade away. Now let us step back, far from the flashbulbs and scandal, into the dust and shadows of an earlier time, when the girl who would be called Marilyn was not yet known to herself, nor to the world that would one day claim her. The child born Norma Jeane Mortensen in the summer of 1926 entered the world without the heraldry of destiny. No trumpets called, no cradle of privilege was laid. Instead, her first breaths were taken within the walls of Los Angeles General Hospital, the cries of other infants nearby mingling with hers, while her mother, Gladys, looked on with eyes already strained by hardship. The father was absent, a figure of shifting rumor, never to be certain, leaving the girl with only half of her inheritance known. From the beginning, absence would be her constant companion, shaping the silence between her footsteps. The city in those years was not the polished playground of stars we now imagine. Hollywood was still raw, its dream factories rising like makeshift temples along dusty streets. Yet even in that landscape of promise, Norma Jeane was bound first not to fame but to struggle. Her mother's instability, haunted by shadows of the mind, meant the child was passed from one household to another, entrusted to foster parents, and at times to cold institutions where children slept in long rows beneath the humming of bare light bulbs. One can imagine the nights, the iron frame of the bed pressing against her small body, the scent of disinfectant, the muffled sobs of other children who, too, had been left adrift. What shapes the soul of a child who never knows where she belongs? Each move, each departure, carved into her a quiet hunger for love and for permanence. Later in her life, when she stood before cameras and adoring crowds, she carried with her not only the practiced smile, but also the echo of those corridors where no voice came when she called. Her beauty became her defense, but also her plea, as though every gaze of admiration might fill the hollow left by an absent father and a fragile mother. As she grew older, the city itself became her witness. Los Angeles, with its sun-struck boulevards and empty lots, knew her footsteps. She would walk beneath billboards promising joy and romance, though her own days were filled with chores, foster guardians, and the endless uncertainty of whether tomorrow would bring yet another move. In those years, the seeds of her resilience were planted. She learned to adapt, to charm when needed, to survive through the power of presence. Yet at night, when the lamps were turned off and the walls whispered with the creaks of old houses, she must have asked herself whether she was truly wanted, truly loved. It is often said that tragedy and genius are twins, bound at birth. With Norma Jeane, the tragedy was present from the first breath, yet within it also stirred the spark that would one day draw millions. The loneliness of childhood gave her the gift of imagination. She could dream, she could become, she could step into roles because reality had offered so little to cling to. What is acting, if not the art of surviving many different lives? And so, from this fragile beginning, the story of Marilyn Monroe unfolds, not as a tale of sudden glamour, but as a long and winding search for safety, love, and meaning. We shall follow her through these passages of time, gently, slowly, as if walking through an old house where memories linger in each corner. And when we return at last to the night of her departure, we will understand that it was not one evening that claimed her, but an entire lifetime of shadows and longing. Let us now turn fully to the first part of her journey, when she was still the little girl, nameless in history, and yet already carrying the weight of all that would follow. In the beginning, there was only the child and the shifting ground beneath her. Norma Jeane was not born into the embrace of a stable home, but into the precarious arms of a mother whose own life trembled under invisible storms. Gladys worked at a film cutting room, piecing together reels for Hollywood's early studios, her hands touching the images that the world consumed. Yet while she could assemble the illusions of others, her own world fell apart piece by piece, leaving her daughter to wander among strangers. The first years were a dance of arrivals and departures. When Gladys struggled, little Norma Jeane was placed with the Bolender family, kind but distant foster parents who raised her for a time in the quiet suburb of Hawthorne. Their home was modest, with the smell of bread in the mornings and the rustle of newspapers in the evenings. Yet even there, she was not fully theirs, never truly claimed. The child understood that she was a guest in her own life, waiting for someone to call her home. Memory, for children, does not always form in words, but in sensations. Perhaps she remembered the feel of the wooden floor beneath her bare feet, the scratch of cheap wool blankets, or the sound of a door closing softly at night when the adults thought she slept. Such fragments would remain within her, shaping the woman who later spoke often of her loneliness. For even when crowds gathered to worship her, she carried the inner knowledge of a child left behind. Her mother attempted, at times, to bring her back. Gladys dreamed of a small house where the two of them might live together, a home with a white fence and a garden, away from the uncertainties of rented rooms. She managed for a brief season to give her daughter that vision, a house purchased in 1933, a place of their own. But fate had other plans. Gladys's mind faltered more deeply, shadows crowding her thoughts, until one day she was taken away, declared unfit, her arms bound by forces stronger than love. The home dissolved, and with it the fragile dream of belonging. Norma Jeane was only 7 when she entered the world of institutions. The Los Angeles Orphans' Home stood like a fortress, its walls high, its gates meant to contain not only children but the despair of abandonment. Inside, rows of narrow beds filled the dormitories. The air smelled of soap and metal, the echo of footsteps resounding against the tile floors. She slept among strangers, her small belongings stored in a box that was never truly safe from being taken or lost. To be a child, there was to live in suspension, awaiting the next family that might claim you, never knowing if it would be for a week, a year, or forever. In later interviews, Marilyn spoke of how she used to sit at the window, watching the road beyond the gate, wondering if anyone would come for her. That image of a child gazing outward with hope, mingled with resignation, captures the essence of her early life. Always waiting, always hoping, always fearing disappointment. That gaze would one day be mirrored on the screen, in roles where her vulnerability shone through every smile, captivating audiences who could not look away. The orphanage years carved into her an awareness of impermanence. Every bond could be broken. Every promise could dissolve. It was this knowledge that later fueled both her deep longing for love and her inability to believe fully in its permanence when it appeared. She moved through her marriages and romances like one still searching for the family that had been denied her. Her laughter, her allure, her carefully crafted image, all were attempts to be wanted, to be chosen, to be kept. When she was 9, another chapter opened. She went to live with Grace, a friend of her mother, who became her guardian for a time. Grace was warmer, more affectionate, and for a little while the child found comfort. Yet even here, the ground shifted. Financial troubles, instability, and the needs of adults once again disrupted the fragile securities she thought she had found. By adolescence, she had moved through multiple homes, each departure leaving behind another small fracture in her heart. How strange it is that out of such uncertainty should emerge a figure who would be known worldwide for her radiant presence. Yet perhaps it is not strange at all, for the desire to be loved by all may grow precisely from the wound of being loved by none. Each admirer's gaze, each camera's lens, became a substitute parent, a witness saying, "You are seen, you are wanted, you are real." But in these early years, all that lay ahead. For now, there was only the little girl, walking to school with hand-me-down shoes, clutching books she scarcely believed were hers to keep. She was shy, yet beneath the shyness lay a stubborn resilience. Teachers noted her sweetness, her quiet charm. She was not yet the dazzling figure of legend, but a seed waiting for light. One wonders in those long nights of her childhood if she ever imagined herself as someone greater, if she dreamed of stepping onto a stage or into a story, or perhaps survival itself was enough and dreaming was a luxury she could scarcely afford. Yet within her silence, the ember of imagination burned, waiting to be fanned into flame. And so, we leave her here for the moment, a small child moving through a world of locked doors and temporary beds, her future unseen, her name still unknown beyond her small circle. Around her, Los Angeles grew louder, the movie studios humming, the billboards rising, as though preparing the stage for the girl who would one day step into the spotlight and never escape it. The image lingers, a corridor in the orphanage, lit dimly by a single bulb, her footsteps echoing as she whispers her name, waiting for someone to answer. A corridor lit dimly, footsteps echoing, the child's voice fading into silence. From that muted image we step forward, for silence would not hold her forever. The years began to gather her toward adolescence, toward the slow unveiling of a presence that others could not ignore. When she left the orphanage and moved again into the care of familiar guardians, the girl was no longer the fragile 7-year-old staring through the gate. She was taller now, with hair catching the sun like strands of copper and gold, and a gaze that carried both timidity and an unexpected brightness. Adolescence for Norma Jeane was not easy, for it was stitched together from the same fabric of instability that had always wrapped around her life. Each home that took her in seemed temporary, each promise prone to break. Yet in this shifting ground she began to discover that she carried within her a kind of secret charm, something that made others look twice, something that lifted her above the ordinary. Boys noticed, classmates whispered, and the young girl who had once been shyly withdrawn began to understand that she possessed a power, though she scarcely knew how to use it. Los Angeles in the late 1930s was a city of contrasts. The Depression still cast shadows, yet the movie studios flourished. Young men and women arrived each week, carrying battered suitcases and swollen dreams, hoping to be transformed by the alchemy of Hollywood. For Norma Jeane, it was not yet a conscious dream, but the machinery of fate was already turning. She worked part-time, helped in households, and eventually found herself in a munitions factory during the war years, a girl in coveralls, her hair tied back, serving the nation in its time of need. It was there, among the humming machines and the clatter of metal, that chance opened its door. A photographer, wandering the factory floor to document the efforts of women workers, noticed her. The light seemed to favor her, the angles of her face catching something beyond the ordinary. His lens lingered, and with that click of the shutter, the long path toward transformation began, A single photograph, innocent in itself, but filled with the whisper of possibility. When those images circulated, the response was immediate. Agencies called, opportunities stirred. The girl who had been abandoned and unseen now found herself desired, requested, pursued, not for her need but for her beauty. Modeling came first, simple at the beginning, poses with commercial smiles, advertisements for products, the kind of images that filled magazines and shop windows. Yet even in these early pictures, something glimmered. Behind the bright teeth and tilted head was a softness, a vulnerability that drew the gaze and would not let go. Still, life outside the camera was complicated. At just 16, she married her neighbor, James Dougherty, in part as a way to escape the threat of returning to the orphanage system. It was not a union born of great passion, but of necessity, a young girl seeking stability in a world that never offered it. Their marriage was ordinary, filled with routines and absences as he went to serve in the military. While he was away, her modeling grew, and soon the gap between their lives widened. The marriage could not endure, but from it she learned again the fragility of bonds and the need to forge her own path. Modeling led to more serious opportunities. Studio scouts began to notice her. Screen tests were arranged. Her hair, once auburn brown, was bleached to a shade of blonde that caught the light with radiant clarity. Her name, Norma Jeane, was considered too plain, too common for the screen. She was renamed Marilyn Monroe, a new persona born from the amalgam of invention and suggestion, the death of the ordinary girl and the birth of a symbol. With the new name came the burden of becoming someone she was not, yet someone she would always be expected to remain. As Marilyn, she found herself in the minor roles of films, often uncredited, a face passing across the screen, a figure in the background. But even in those brief glimpses, audiences noticed. She walked differently. She carried a kind of luminous vulnerability. Executives and directors began to sense that there was more to her than the surface, that if nurtured, she might become more than another hopeful starlet lost in the crowd. Still, the road was not smooth. Contracts came and went. Studios hesitated, and she lived precariously, moving from apartment to apartment, never far from the edge of poverty. To support herself, she returned to modeling, sometimes for pin-up magazines that revealed more than the conservative eye wished to see. These photographs, later a source of both scandal and intrigue, showed her not merely as a body to be gazed upon, but as a woman unafraid to reveal herself, though perhaps beneath that daring lay the same hunger for attention and love that had shaped her as a child. One can imagine the conflict within her during these years. To be seen was to survive, yet to be seen in such a way was to risk being defined only by the surface, never by the depths she longed to share. This tension, between the image and the soul, between the admired body and the unseen heart, would follow her all her life, deepening as her fame grew. But for now, she was still on the ascent, her name not yet immortal, but her presence already felt. She studied her craft, watching other actresses, learning the art of movement, the subtle tilt of the head, the careful delivery of a line. She absorbed everything, determined not to be dismissed as another pretty face. Beneath the makeup and the camera's glare, she was still the girl from the orphanage, determined to prove herself worthy of love, worthy of permanence. At night, when the city hummed outside her window, she would sit alone, the makeup washed away, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders, and she must have wondered whether she could hold on to this fragile new beginning. Would Hollywood embrace her, or would it discard her as so many others before? The uncertainty remained, as steady as the ticking of the clock. The flashbulbs of those early photo sessions linger still in memory, the photographer's bulb flaring, leaving after-images of light across her eyes, like tiny suns that refuse to fade. That glow would follow her into the next stage of her journey, where the reinvention into Marilyn Monroe became complete, and the ordinary life of Norma Jeane was finally left behind. And so we end this part with the echo of a shutter click. A brief flare of light caught on film, a light that would spread across the world yet would never truly reveal the darkness from which it was born. A flashbulb's afterglow lingers, small suns floating in her vision, refusing to fade. From this flare of light, we step into a room of mirrors where the reflection of Norma Jeane slowly dissolved, and in its place emerged the figure the world would come to know as Marilyn Monroe. In those years, Hollywood functioned like a great forge, taking in raw ore and melting it until it could be poured into the mold of marketable beauty. Young women arrived with plain names and ordinary faces, and they left transformed, renamed, repackaged, their every detail adjusted to fit the dream that the studios sought to sell. Marilyn's transformation was no different, though in her case the alchemy produced something that would outshine nearly all others. The first step was her name. Norma Jeane Mortensen, sometimes written Baker, sounded unremarkable, too closely tied to the anonymity of her past. The studio suggested Marilyn, after Marilyn Miller, a stage actress admired in earlier decades. The surname Monroe came from her mother's lineage, offering a thread of continuity that would later feel like irony, for though her family gave her so little, it was their name she carried into immortality. Marilyn Monroe, a name that seemed to roll like music, a name that shone even when written in black ink upon a page. Yet the name alone could not create the legend. Hair was bleached into a luminous blonde, a color not of the earth, but of fantasy, brighter than wheat, more radiant than sunlight. Makeup was applied with care, red lips shaped into a soft bow, cheeks dusted with warmth, eyes lined to appear larger, more inviting, as though every glance might be an invitation. Even her voice, naturally soft and somewhat hesitant, was encouraged toward a breathy cadence that would become one of her signatures. Piece by piece the woman was constructed, and yet behind every brushstroke of invention lay the quiet girl who still sought to be loved. She stood often before the mirror, rehearsing not only expressions but entire selves. Smiles were tested, glances perfected, gestures tried until they seemed natural. The woman who once felt like a guest in her own life now learned to host the entire world, but the performance came at a cost. Each evening, when the mirror reflected the paint removed, the question must have arisen, who am I without this mask? Was she still Norma Jeane, or had she truly become Marilyn? Could the two coexist, or must one forever hide in the shadow of the other? Her earliest film appearances were fleeting. Secretaries, waitresses, chorus girls. She spoke a line or two, walked across the screen, and vanished, but audiences noticed. Critics sometimes dismissed her as another blonde, but viewers wrote letters, asked who she was, demanded to see more. There was something in the way she occupied even the smallest frame, something vulnerable that shimmered beneath the glamour. It was as though she was not acting, but living, and people could not look away. During this period, she studied with care. She observed the great actresses, how they held themselves, how they commanded attention without effort. She learned from directors and coaches, but also from her own instincts, which told her that sincerity could pierce through artifice. She was determined not to remain in the background, not to be another disposable ornament of the studio system. Within her was ambition, though ambition clothed in gentleness, not the ruthless hunger of others. She wanted not simply fame, but recognition, the acknowledgement that she was more than the surface. Still, Hollywood was a place where surfaces ruled. The studio heads were men who calculated beauty as one might calculate profits, and for them, Marilyn's value lay first in her image. Photographers adored her, magazines clamored for her likeness, and soon she was as recognizable as any star of the age. Yet even in these earliest years of fame, she confessed to friends that she felt lonely, that the admiration of crowds did not ease the ache of the child within who still longed for unconditional love. The reinvention of Norma Jeane into Marilyn was not only physical, but spiritual, a rebirth that carried with it both glory and tragedy. She once said that when she walked into a room as Norma Jeane, few noticed her. But when she stepped forward as Marilyn, the world turned its head. This duality haunted her. She could summon Marilyn at will, tilting her hips, lowering her lashes, smiling with practiced warmth, and suddenly all eyes belonged to her. But when she returned home, removed the mask, and sat quietly alone, she feared that no one saw Norma Jeane at all. What must it feel like to live as two people, one adored by millions, the other nearly invisible? The glamour of reinvention carried within it the seeds of disquiet. Yet at this moment in her journey, the future sorrows were not yet visible. All that shimmered was possibility, the sense that she might rise, that she might finally grasp the permanence she had always been denied. She accepted roles with eagerness, however small, and slowly her name began to appear in credits. Journalists took notice. Rumors of her beauty circulated in studio halls. Agents spoke of her as one to watch, a potential star in the making. And through it all, she remained patient, her humility masking the deep flame of desire. She wanted to prove herself, to reach a place where she could no longer be discarded, no longer be passed along like the child she once was. Yet behind the glamour of her transformation lay shadows. To become Marilyn was also to surrender Norma Jeane. Each new photograph of her painted lips and platinum hair buried deeper the memory of the girl in hand-me-down dresses, walking barefoot across creaking wooden floors. Perhaps she felt relief to leave that child behind, yet perhaps she also feared losing her completely, as though without the memory of Norma Jeane, Marilyn might stand hollow, a shell without substance. The perfume of those early years lingered. Powder, lipstick, the faint scent of studio halls. When she left a room, traces of her presence remained, as though her very being imprinted itself on the air. Assistants and fellow actors spoke of how she glowed even when silent, her vulnerability shining through every gesture. She seemed to carry within her a contradiction, the carefully constructed mask of the world's most desired woman, and the trembling honesty of a girl who had once waited by the window for someone to arrive. The scent of perfume left on an empty dressing chair, that is the image that remains from this period of transformation. She had stepped away, leaving behind the aura of Marilyn Monroe, while somewhere within her still lingered Norma Jeane, unseen, unheard, yet never truly gone. The chair waits in silence, the fragrance fading slowly into the air as though whispering of the fragile divide between the woman she was and the legend she was becoming. The perfume left on the empty dressing chair drifts softly through the air, fading into stillness, and in that stillness we hear the echo of footsteps along the polished halls of a studio. These were the corridors where Marilyn began to take her earliest steps in film, not yet the headline star, but an apprentice to the machinery of cinema. The chair she left behind in the dressing room was soon replaced by another seat, this time on a set, beneath glaring lights that revealed every flaw, every uncertainty. Here she learned that the transformation into Marilyn Monroe was not complete until she proved herself before the unblinking eye of the camera. The studios of mid-century Hollywood were both temples and factories. On the outside, they seemed like grand fortresses of art, but within, the process was mechanical, each production timed and budgeted, each actor reduced to a part in a larger scheme. For the young Marilyn, roles came slowly. She was placed at the edges of stories, a secretary with a line, a nurse glimpsed in the background, a girl who smiled and then vanished before the audience could even learn her name. Yet in these small fragments, she gave more than was expected. She leaned into each moment, delivering gestures with sincerity, letting her eyes speak even when her mouth was silent. The camera seemed to recognize her, to favor her, as though it too sensed the presence of something unguarded within her. In those years, she spent long hours waiting in casting offices where dozens of other young women sat in neat rows, each carefully made up, each hoping to be chosen. Waiting on sets where her call might be delayed, where the director might decide at the last moment to cut her scene. Waiting in dressing rooms, small and bare, where she rehearsed lines quietly to herself, whispering them until they seemed natural. Waiting, always waiting, much as she had once waited in the orphanage corridor, only now the stakes were different, the promises larger, though no less fragile. But waiting did not mean idleness. Marilyn observed. She watched how seasoned actors carried themselves, how they shifted their weight before speaking, how they adjusted their voices to match the rhythm of dialogue. She studied the way directors framed a shot, how light sculpted the human face. She practiced her own expressions in the mirror, not with vanity, but with discipline, searching for a balance between honesty and allure. Every moment was a lesson, every mistake a chance to refine her craft. At times, discouragement pressed upon her. Studios were notorious for discarding young actresses after a season, and she feared she might be forgotten before she had even begun. Contracts lapsed, offers fell silent, and once again she found herself modeling, returning to the magazines that had once given her entry into the industry. The photographs were beautiful, yet they reminded her of the fine line she walked, admired for her body, but not yet valued for her talent. She longed to be more than a picture. She longed to be a voice, a presence, a soul. Her friends from those days remembered her vulnerability. She was not brash, not hardened by ambition in the way that many around her were. She spoke softly, often questioning her own worth, and yet there was a quiet determination beneath her doubt. She wanted to belong in film, to prove that she could endure not merely as decoration, but as art. She confessed at times that she feared being invisible, that she feared the world might never see her for who she was inside. These fears, woven into her performances, gave them their unique texture. Audiences sensed her fragility, and that fragility became part of her power. When she finally received slightly larger roles, the screen responded. In films such as The Asphalt Jungle and All About Eve, though her parts were brief, critics took notice. She was magnetic, they said, even when she spoke only a handful of lines. She seemed to embody vulnerability itself, the kind of softness that concealed an unspoken sorrow. Hollywood had many stars, but few who carried such luminous sadness within their beauty. It was this quality that distinguished her, that kept her from fading into the chorus line of forgotten faces. And yet, the struggle continued. Success was slow, uneven. Contracts were negotiated and lost. Money was scarce. At times, she doubted whether she could endure the uncertainty, whether she might return to obscurity. But each time despair threatened to pull her back, a small role appeared. Another chance to be seen, another opportunity to prove herself. Like the child who survived through resilience, Marilyn too persisted, each day waiting for a door to open fully, not just a crack. Behind the studio walls, her life was no easier. She lived in modest apartments, often alone, her evenings quiet save for the hum of the city outside. She read books, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, poetry, trying to nourish a mind that others dismissed. Few believed she was intellectual, yet she hungered for knowledge, perhaps because knowledge was something that could not be taken away, unlike fame, which might vanish overnight. She wrote in notebooks reflections and thoughts, words that revealed her inner longing for meaning beyond the surface. The image that remains from this time is of a film reel turning endlessly, round and round, the celluloid flickering with images both fleeting and eternal. Marilyn's presence flickered too, sometimes only for seconds on the screen, yet even in those seconds, she left a mark. Viewers leaned forward, curious, unsettled, drawn. She was no longer only Norma Jeane, no longer only Marilyn the invention. She was beginning to merge the two into something authentic, something that breathed even within the confines of a studio role. Her earliest films may not be remembered in detail, yet they formed the foundation upon which her legend would be built. They were the first tentative notes of a song that would later swell into a melody recognized across the world. Without these minor steps, without these days of waiting and learning, there would have been no star, no icon, no mystery that lingers to this day. The reel keeps turning, its clicking rhythm steady, relentless. It spins forward into the next chapter, carrying her toward the breakthrough roles that would lift her from obscurity into the center of the world's gaze. But for now, we linger in the half-light of the studio, where she stands at the edge of the frame, patient, uncertain, luminous, even when nearly unseen. And as the reel turns, never stopping, so too does her story continue, carrying her from the margins into the bright blaze of the screen. The reel spins forward, never stopping, and from its flickering rhythm we emerge into the blaze of brighter lights, the red carpets unfurled, the sound of applause swelling like a tide. It was here, in the early 1950s, that Marilyn Monroe stepped out of the background and into the center of the frame. No longer merely a fleeting face, she became a presence, a name on the lips of audiences, the camera's favorite subject, the promise of Hollywood fulfilled. Her breakthrough was not sudden, but built piece by piece, much as her earlier life had been stitched together from fragments. With each minor role, each fleeting appearance, she gathered attention until the studios could no longer ignore her. Niagara in 1953 placed her at the heart of desire and danger, the femme fatale whose beauty carried both allure and threat. Audiences were captivated, not only by her physicality, but by the undercurrent of fragility beneath it. She seemed at once powerful and breakable, a contradiction that made her irresistible. Soon after came Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, with her shimmering performance of Lorelei Lee, and then How to Marry a Millionaire, each role weaving her further into the fabric of popular culture. On the surface, her rise was triumphant. Photographs show her smiling on red carpets, wrapped in glittering gowns, her every step accompanied by the flash of cameras. She became the embodiment of glamour, the dream that Hollywood promised to deliver. Yet within, the old uncertainties remained. Marilyn often confessed to friends that she felt like a fraud, that the world admired her without ever truly seeing her. Fame surrounded her like a cloak, dazzling and suffocating all at once. She longed not only to be admired, but to be understood. Yet the deeper she rose into stardom, the less she was certain that such understanding was possible. The early 1950s were years of transformation for the United States as well. The war was over, prosperity expanded, and Hollywood became both entertainment and ideology, selling images of beauty, romance, and success. Marilyn fit seamlessly into this landscape, yet she also stood apart. Unlike the untouchable goddesses of earlier decades, she embodied accessibility, vulnerability, a woman who seemed real even in her perfection. Audiences did not only desire her, they pitied her, loved her, wished to comfort her. This delicate balance between icon and innocent set her apart and made her legend inevitable. But the glamour carried shadows. Each red carpet evening ended in a quiet room. Each roar of applause faded into hollow silence. Marilyn, still haunted by her childhood, felt the emptiness of success when measured only by external praise. She would sit by herself in hotel rooms, staring at the telephone, hoping for a call from someone who cared not for Marilyn Monroe, but for Norma Jeane, the girl who still lived behind the mask. Often, the call never came. Her romances during this period mirrored the contradictions of her public life. She attracted men of fame and power, men who adored her beauty but struggled to comprehend her complexity. She longed for a love that would be stable, permanent, unconditional, yet her very fame made such love difficult to find. Those who sought her often sought the image, not the person. Those who reached the person sometimes recoiled at her vulnerability, unable to bear the depth of her need. Thus her rise in Hollywood coincided with a deeper loneliness, a truth that no applause could erase. Still, on screen she glowed. Directors spoke of how she transformed the energy of a set, how the camera adored her even when she faltered in lines or hesitated before takes. She had a way of making imperfection seem authentic, of turning delay into charm. Audiences never noticed the flaws, they saw only the radiant whole. She had become the star she had once dreamed of, though the dream felt less solid from within than it appeared from without. In Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, her performance of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend became iconic, her pink satin gown glittering, her gestures playful yet knowing. The number was later imitated by many, yet none captured the original's strange blend of innocence and irony. She seemed to embody both the desire for wealth and the knowledge of its emptiness, smiling even as her eyes betrayed a different longing. Critics debated whether she was conscious of this contradiction, whether she intended it, or whether it was simply who she was. A woman whose every gesture carried both allure and sorrow. As her fame grew, the studios tightened their hold. Contracts demanded more roles, more publicity appearances, more obedience to the system that had created her. Marilyn, however, began to resist. She wanted better scripts, more serious opportunities, roles that would allow her to show depth rather than only charm. This resistance placed her at odds with executives who saw her primarily as a commodity, a blonde starlet designed to sell tickets. She walked a dangerous line, for rebellion could mean the end of her career, yet compliance threatened the end of her soul. During this period, she began to study acting more seriously, seeking to refine her craft beyond what the studios expected. She joined classes, worked with coaches, studied methods that emphasized authenticity and emotional truth. She yearned to be taken seriously as an artist, not merely admired as a symbol. This yearning was rooted, perhaps, in the same hunger that had driven her since childhood, the need to be recognized, not just seen, the need for her inner self to matter as much as her outward image. The press, of course, did not capture these subtleties. Headlines celebrated her beauty, speculated about her romances, photographed her at every turn. She became both idol and spectacle, her privacy dissolving under the weight of public fascination. Every gesture was magnified, every stumble noted, every smile interpreted. The world felt entitled to her, as though she belonged not to herself but to the millions who adored her. Fame had given her permanence in the eyes of the world, yet it had also stolen from her the possibility of belonging to herself. The applause roared, champagne glasses clinked, flashbulbs exploded. Her image was everywhere, on posters and magazines, in the dreams of countless admirers. She had risen, as she once hoped, from the orphanage corridor to the pinnacle of Hollywood, yet even at this height, she felt the same uncertainty. Was she loved or merely consumed? Was she seen or merely gazed upon? These questions, whispered in the quiet of her evenings, lingered without answer. And so this chapter ends not with triumph alone, but with the hollow echo of applause fading into silence. For every cheer that rose, there followed a stillness that pressed upon her heart, reminding her that fame could dazzle but not heal, could adorn but not embrace. The image remains, a crowd roaring with joy as she steps into the light, her smile radiant, her gown glittering, and yet behind it all, an emptiness she cannot quiet. As the noise fades, We hear it, the silence of the woman within, waiting still for the permanence that applause cannot provide. The roar of applause fades into hollow silence, and from that silence there comes a whisper, delicate and airy, the rustle of fabric lifted by an unseen wind. The scene is New York, the year 1954, and Marilyn Monroe stands above a subway grate, her white dress billowing upward as though the city itself conspires to reveal her. Cameras flash, crowds gather, and in that fleeting instant a single image is captured that will follow her forever, turning her from a celebrated actress into a myth, an emblem, a figure etched into the collective imagination of the world. The moment belonged to the filming of The 7-Year Itch, directed by Billy Wilder, a film that would become one of the cornerstones of her legend. The scene itself was playful, a gesture of comedy, yet when performed by Marilyn, it transformed into something larger. The dress lifted, her laughter sparkled, and yet within the laughter there was again that hint of innocence, as though she were not only aware of the gaze upon her, but also astonished by it. Crowds pressed against barricades, photographers scrambled for position, and the sound of shutter clicks mingled with the rush of air from the passing train beneath. It is said that the filming of that scene drew such a commotion that it had to be reshot elsewhere, the noise of the onlookers overwhelming the set. But the damage, or perhaps the gift, was already done. Those photographs, printed and reprinted, circulated across the globe. The image of Marilyn, her white dress caught in flight, became not merely a film still, but a cultural icon, repeated endlessly until it seemed to stand outside of time. For many, she was forever the woman in white above the grate, laughing, glowing, alive. Yet what did that moment mean to her? For while the world saw glamour and delight, Marilyn herself felt the strain of being reduced once again to an image. She wanted to be taken seriously, to be valued for her craft, yet the scene cemented her place as the ultimate symbol of sexual allure. It was both a triumph and a prison. Her visibility was complete, but her invisibility as Norma Jeane deepened. She confessed privately that she feared she would never escape the role of the blonde, never be allowed to show the depth she carried within. Her marriage to Joe DiMaggio, the baseball legend, was unraveling at the same time. He had adored her, perhaps, but he could not accept the gaze of millions upon her, could not bear the public adoration of his wife. When he saw the subway grate scene filmed before hundreds of cheering onlookers, his fury boiled, his jealousy undeniable. Their love, once tender, crumbled under the weight of fame and expectation. The marriage dissolved, leaving Marilyn once again alone, longing for stability but finding only the shifting ground of celebrity. The image of the dress became a paradox. For the world, it was delight, fantasy, eternal allure. For Marilyn, it was the emblem of her entrapment, the proof that her body mattered more than her voice, that her image outweighed her soul. And yet, even knowing this, she played the role with grace, offering the world what it desired, while hiding her sorrow behind the sparkle of her eyes. In these years, her films grew more prominent. She was no longer a supporting actress, but the centerpiece, her name written in bold above the titles. Audiences adored her, critics debated her, and the studios profited from her presence. Each role she played seemed to echo the contradiction of her life. The woman who dazzled others even while uncertain of her own worth. She was cast again and again as the archetype of innocence mingled with desire, the blonde who seduced without intending, who charmed even as she confessed her confusion. In each role, the audience saw not only a character, but the woman herself, the vulnerability of Marilyn Monroe shining through the fiction. Yet behind the camera, she continued her struggle for control. She established her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, determined to create films that would allow her to expand beyond the typecasting of the studios. This was a bold act, rare for actresses of her time, a declaration that she was not merely property, but a force capable of shaping her own destiny. For a moment, it seemed she might succeed, that she might wrestle freedom from the very system that sought to contain her. But the battles were wearying, the resistance constant, and though she won small victories, the toll upon her spirit was immense. Her studies in acting deepened. She worked with teachers who encouraged her to draw upon her emotions, to transform her pain into art. For Marilyn, this was natural. Her performances were always infused with the authenticity of her longing. Yet the process was exhausting, for it required her to reopen wounds she carried from childhood, to expose vulnerabilities she often wished to hide. On screen, the result was luminous. Off-screen, it left her fragile, drained, uncertain of where the performance ended and where she began. The subway dress image, meanwhile, followed her relentlessly. It appeared in newspapers, on posters, in endless retellings. Even as she tried to move beyond it, the world insisted on returning to that moment, freezing her forever in white fabric and laughter. Perhaps she wondered whether she would ever be known for more than that fleeting instant. Perhaps she feared that the myth was already eclipsing the woman, that the photograph would outlive the person. And yet, there is something haunting in that image when seen today. The laughter seems genuine, the surprise unfeigned. It is as though, for a brief second, the mask dropped and the world glimpsed not only Marilyn the star, but Norma Jeane, the girl. Astonished that so many cared to look at her. That paradox, innocence and allure, joy and sorrow, revelation and concealment, was the essence of her being. No single moment captured it more fully than the whisper of fabric above the grate. As the film concluded and audiences cheered, Marilyn returned again to her solitude. Fame had grown larger, but so had her loneliness. She was adored by millions, yet longed for a single embrace that would not dissolve, a single voice that would answer when she called. The subway grate had lifted her into myth, but myths are lonely things, worshipped but never held. The whisper of fabric fades now, the train passing below, the crowd dispersing, the photographers lowering their cameras. The dress falls back into place and Marilyn steps aside, smiling still, though behind the smile rests the quiet ache of a woman who wonders whether she has given away too much of herself to the gaze of others. And as she walks away, the echo of that whisper lingers, carrying her forward into the next chapter of her life, where fragile romances and unfinished love letters await her, each one another attempt to find the permanence that still eluded her. The whisper of fabric settles, the dress falls back into place, and Marilyn walks away with her smile still painted on her lips, though inside an ache persists, unfinished, unresolved. From this ache, we follow her into the realm of fragile romances, the tender quarrels and fragile embraces that became the rhythm of her private life. For while the world adored her image, she longed only for a love that would not vanish, for a home that would not dissolve, for permanence after a lifetime of impermanence. Her marriage to Joe DiMaggio had seemed, at first, like the answer to that longing. He was the great baseball hero, stoic and strong, adored by crowds almost as much as she was. For a brief moment, they seemed the golden couple of America, beauty and strength entwined. But beneath the sheen of their public union lay tensions that could not be resolved. Joe loved her, yet he could not bear the gaze of millions upon her body. He wanted her to himself, private, sheltered, removed from the spotlight that defined her very existence. When he witnessed the subway grate scene, filmed before hundreds of cheering strangers, his rage erupted. To him, it was humiliation. To her, it was merely the work she had been called to perform. Their quarrels deepened, words sharpened, and though their love lingered, it could not survive the weight of fame. After 9 short months, the marriage dissolved, leaving Marilyn with yet another fragment of her heart broken, another dream of permanence shattered. Still, Joe never disappeared entirely from her life. In later years, he returned quietly, visiting her, offering support in her darker hours. His devotion remained even after their union collapsed, and some have wondered whether, in his silence and constancy, he was the one who loved her most faithfully. But in those years of her rise, she was already moving toward another love, one that promised intellect, art, and a sense of belonging in a different world. That love was Arthur Miller, the playwright whose words carried the weight of tragedy and human frailty. Marilyn first met him in the early 50s, and there was an immediate recognition, though their paths did not join until later. To her, he represented the seriousness she craved, the life of the mind she longed to enter. To him, she was a muse, a figure of fascination, a woman who embodied vulnerability and desire, but also carried a depth few others perceived. Their relationship blossomed into marriage in 1956, and for a time, it seemed as though Marilyn had finally found the balance she sought: beauty united with intellect, love bound with respect. The years with Miller were filled with complexity. She moved to New York, studied acting more intensely, surrounded herself with teachers and artists who treated her not merely as a star, but as a student, a woman striving to grow. She read voraciously, filled notebooks with reflections, wrestled with her own limitations. With him, she felt valued for more than her image, at least at first. But even here, the old demons returned. She feared abandonment, feared that even in his love she might one day be cast aside. Her dependence grew heavy, and Miller, though devoted, struggled beneath its weight. Their marriage was tested by the very thing that had drawn them together, his art. He wrote, he reflected, he described his world in words, and within those words, she sometimes found herself revealed in ways that wounded her. She once discovered a note he had written, confessing doubts about their union, calling her fragile, difficult, a burden. The discovery broke her heart, for it confirmed her deepest fear, that even those who loved her might eventually tire of her need. She carried the note with her for years, unable to forget the wound, unable to let go of the ache it caused. Still, for a time, they endured. They traveled together. They dreamed of projects. They tried to weave their worlds into harmony. She starred in The Prince and the Showgirl with Laurence Olivier, and later in The Misfits, written by Miller himself, a film that carried within it the shadows of their failing marriage. On screen, her performance glowed with sincerity, but behind the camera, tensions between them grew unbearable. The marriage that had once seemed her salvation ended in divorce in 1961, leaving her again adrift. Another chapter closed, another hope dissolved. Throughout these romances, one thread remained constant: Marilyn's longing for stability, for the love she had never known as a child. Each marriage, each affair, carried the weight of that longing, and each collapse deepened her sense of fragility. She was adored by millions, yet what she wanted was far simpler: to be held, to be kept, to be chosen without condition. That hunger, unresolved, gave her performances their haunting depth, for audiences sensed in her characters the same yearning she carried in her life. Her friends remembered how she would write notes, unfinished letters, fragments of thoughts scrawled in uneven handwriting. Some were love letters, left unsent, confessing her devotion, her despair, her need. Others were simple reflections, words written in the quiet of hotel rooms, where she stayed alone after nights of public adoration. A few of these scraps survive, testaments to her loneliness, small windows into the heart of a woman who seemed to have everything yet felt she had nothing that truly endured. It is perhaps no surprise that in her romances, as in her career, she lived at the edges of contradiction. She wanted to be protected, yet she resisted being controlled. She desired intimacy, yet she feared exposure. She longed for permanence, yet her life remained in constant motion. Another room, another city, another role. These contradictions were not weaknesses alone. They were also the source of her humanity. They made her real, and they made her unforgettable. The image that remains from this chapter is of a bedside table, a sheet of paper resting upon it, words half written, the ink fading at the edges where her pen had paused. A note to a lover, perhaps, or to herself, expressing feelings that could never fully be spoken aloud. The letter is unfinished, as though interrupted by life itself, and in its incompleteness lies the essence of her search. Always begun, never complete. Always hopeful, never secure. The paper remains upon the table, the handwriting paused mid-sentence, the silence of the room heavy with what might have been said but never was. It waits there still, untouched, carrying us forward into the next part of her story, where the stage lights of acting classes will illuminate her again, where the hunger for authenticity will press her deeper into the art she longed to master. The paper rests upon the bedside table, words half written, the ink stilled mid-stroke, silence pressing down on what might have been said. From this unfinished letter, we step into another room, a different space where silence was broken by voices rising, falling, trembling with emotion. It is the dimly lit classroom of an acting studio, where Marilyn Monroe sat among strangers and peers, her notebook open, her gaze intent, her heart exposed. Here, away from the glamour of the cameras, she sought something that had always eluded her: authenticity. Truth, the right to be taken seriously as more than a surface. The method, as taught by Lee Strasberg and others of the Actors Studio in New York, demanded vulnerability. It asked the actor to mine their own wounds, to open their own scars, and to allow the pain of memory to pour into the performance. For Marilyn, this was not an act of technique, but of survival. Her life was already filled with wounds, her childhood a tapestry of abandonment, her romances a series of unfinished promises. She brought all of this into the classroom, trembling as she spoke, trembling as she performed, but luminous because her trembling was real. Her peers, hardened by ambition, could not help but be moved. They saw in her what the world often overlooked: a soul searching for meaning, a woman willing to give more of herself than most dared. In these classrooms, she was not Marilyn the star. She was Norma Jeane, the girl who had walked barefoot across cold floors, who had stared out orphanage windows, who had feared silence more than anything else. Her vulnerability, raw and unpolished, was her gift. When she performed, she could make others weep, not because she acted, but because she revealed. And yet, this very gift left her fragile. After each session, she was often exhausted, shaken, tears staining her cheeks. For to live one's wounds anew is to risk never healing them. Still, she returned, again and again, drawn to the possibility that through art she might redeem her suffering. She read voraciously: Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare, Tennessee Williams. She scribbled in notebooks, underlined passages, wrote reflections in the margins. To the world outside, she was the blonde goddess of Hollywood. But in these private hours, she was a student, a seeker, a woman yearning for depth. Many who knew her in those years spoke of her as intensely serious, her mind always working, her questions sharp and unrelenting. She was not content to coast upon fame. She wanted to create, to matter, to be remembered not only for her beauty, but for her craft. The contrast between these classrooms and the studio sets of Hollywood could not have been greater. In the classrooms, the light was dim, the air heavy with cigarette smoke, the focus on truth rather than polish. In Hollywood, the lights were glaring, the scripts designed for profit, the performances crafted for glamour. Marilyn existed between these worlds, torn by the contradiction of who she was expected to be and who she longed to become. She once confessed that she felt as though there were two women inside her: Marilyn Monroe, the image adored by millions, and Norma Jeane, the girl who still whispered from the shadows, begging to be seen. Her pursuit of authenticity did not go unnoticed. Directors who worked with her often spoke of the intensity she brought, how even in light comedies she could infuse a line with unspoken emotion. Audiences sensed it too. They laughed at her humor, admired her charm, but also felt a pang of sympathy, a recognition that beneath the laughter was someone fragile, someone who might break if touched too roughly. This was the paradox of her screen presence. She was both fantasy and reality, myth and human, untouchable and heartbreakingly near. Yet the very pursuit of depth brought her into conflict with the studios. Executives wanted the image, the blonde with the playful smile, the box office guarantee. They did not want an actress who demanded better scripts, who delayed productions because she sought sincerity in every line. Her lateness, her hesitations, her endless rehearsals became legendary, frustrating those around her. But what seemed to others like irresponsibility was, for Marilyn, the desperate search for truth. She could not simply recite words. She needed to feel them, to live them, or else she felt she was betraying herself. This tension strained her further. She wanted respect, yet the more she demanded it, the more she was criticized. Gossip columns painted her as difficult, unstable, unreliable. Few understood the depth of her struggle, the courage it took to resist being reduced to a mask. She carried the weight of her contradictions like a cross, adored and mocked, desired and dismissed, powerful and powerless all at once. Friends remembered evenings when she returned from classes exhausted, curling up in a corner, her notebooks beside her, her eyes heavy with both sadness and hope. She would speak softly of her dreams, to play serious roles, to embody women of complexity, to prove that beauty could coexist with intellect, that vulnerability could be strength. And yet, even as she spoke, she feared that the world would never allow her such freedom. She was trapped in the cage of her own image, a cage gilded with diamonds and flashbulbs, but a cage nonetheless. The stage lights of the classroom dim one by one, leaving her in shadow. That is the image we hold. Marilyn seated quietly in the near dark, her notebook open, her pen resting between her fingers, her gaze distant as though searching for a self that still eluded her. Around her, the voices of others fade, but within her, the longing remains, the hunger to be taken seriously, to be loved not for what she seemed, but for what she was. The light above her flickers, then dims fully, leaving her in near darkness. It is from this shadow that the next part of her journey emerges. For as the classroom empties, she returns home alone, where the scattered pills and sleepless nights await her. Reminders that the battle for authenticity was waged not only on the stage but within her very body and soul. The classroom light flickers, then dims fully, leaving her in shadow. From this darkness, we follow her into the stillness of her private rooms, where no audience waits, no director calls, no peer applauds. Here, alone, Marilyn confronted a battle not of performance but of survival, a war waged quietly against her own body and spirit. For fame had given her much, yet it had also pressed upon her a weight she could scarcely bear. And in the silence of her nights, that weight revealed itself in the form of scattered bottles and restless hours. The habit began slowly, almost innocently. Hollywood was a place where pills were common, prescribed for sleep, for nerves, for the endless demands of production schedules. The studios needed their stars rested, bright and available, and doctors obliged with tablets that dulled the mind and calmed the body. For Marilyn, already prone to anxiety and sleeplessness, the relief these offered was undeniable. A pill to sleep, a pill to wake, a pill to steady her trembling hands before a scene. At first it seemed manageable, a tool to help her survive the relentless rhythm of her work. But gradually the line blurred. Sleep became elusive without the aid of chemistry. Anxiety sharpened whenever the tablets were absent, and what had begun as help became necessity. Her friends recalled how her nightstands were littered with bottles, how she carried pills in her purse, how she measured her days not only by the ticking of the clock, but by the rhythm of dosages. She would sit at her dressing table, the mirror reflecting her weary eyes, and with a sigh she would swallow what she needed to silence the unrest within. Curtains were often drawn in her rooms, shutting out the daylight, creating a cocoon where she could retreat from the world. The silence within was heavy, broken only by the hum of a refrigerator, the occasional ring of a telephone she did not answer. These were the hours when her loneliness pressed most heavily, when the applause of the world seemed like a distant echo, and the face in the mirror looked more like a stranger than a friend. She longed for rest, for peace, for the ability to quiet her mind without the crutch of medicine, yet peace eluded her, and so she reached again for the small white tablets that promised oblivion, if only for a night. Her health grew fragile. Exhaustion weighed upon her body, and her appearances on set became increasingly difficult. Directors complained of her lateness, her inability to arrive prepared, her disappearances into solitude. Yet behind the gossip of unreliability was the truth of a woman fighting to keep herself upright, a woman whose body and soul were eroded by the very demands that had made her a star. Each time she faltered, she felt the sting of criticism more sharply, for it echoed the voices of her past. "You are not enough. You are too fragile. You will be left behind." And so, to silence the fear, she turned again to the pills, each swallow both a refuge and a chain. There were moments, of course, when she tried to break free. She sought doctors who might help her reduce her dependence. She attempted to change her routines. She leaned upon friends for support. But the cycles of insomnia and anxiety were relentless, and Hollywood offered little patience for weakness. A film could not wait for the healing of a star, and so the pressure returned, and with it the bottles, the half-full glasses of water, the uneasy sleep that was more oblivion than rest. And yet, even in this fragile state, she gave performances that remain unforgettable. Films like Bus Stop and Some Like It Hot revealed her brilliance, her ability to turn vulnerability into art. On screen, she seemed alive in a way that astonished those who knew her off-screen. She glowed, she charmed, she moved audiences to laughter and to sympathy. The paradox deepened. The woman who could scarcely hold herself together in private gave the world performances that seemed effortless, radiant, eternal. How is it that the most fragile souls often create the most lasting art? Perhaps because fragility itself, when revealed, touches something universal in all who watch. Her notebooks from this time reveal her inner turmoil. She wrote of feeling like a fragment, like a piece of glass broken from a larger whole. She wondered whether she would ever be loved without condition, whether she would ever find peace. She reflected upon death, not with longing, but with a kind of weary curiosity, as though she sensed that her struggles might one day carry her to that threshold. She was not blind to her fragility. She knew it well, and she lived with its shadow daily. Those who visited her during these years spoke of the strange quiet in her home, the curtains drawn, the faint scent of perfume lingering, the scattered papers and books lying beside the pill bottles. She might greet a friend with warmth, laugh with sudden brightness, and then moments later retreat into silence, her eyes distant, her body heavy with fatigue. It was as though she lived between two worlds, the bright stage of Hollywood and the dim chamber of her own solitude, neither of which could wholly contain her. The image that lingers is simple, yet haunting. A glass of water half full beside her hand, the surface trembling slightly as though disturbed by the faintest breath. Around it lie the small white tablets, silent, indifferent, waiting. The glass reflects the dim light of a lamp, casting a shimmer upon the wall. It is a scene both ordinary and devastating, for it captures the essence of her struggle, the search for rest in a world that offered none, the reliance upon fragile means to silence a pain too deep to name. The glass remains on the table, untouched for the moment, half full, waiting still. And from this stillness, the next part of her journey unfolds, for beyond the drawn curtains and sleepless nights lies the deeper isolation of fame itself, the cage of adoration that left her surrounded by millions yet lonelier than ever before. The glass of water trembles slightly in the dim room, half full, its surface reflecting the fragile glow of a single lamp. From this still image, we move outward, past the curtains drawn tight, into the larger world where fame itself became both her crown and her cage. For Marilyn Monroe, adoration was vast, yet isolation was deeper still, and each step into the spotlight only seemed to push her further into the solitude of her own heart. Hotel rooms were her constant companions in those years. The film industry pulled her across cities, across coasts, across oceans, and though each room carried its own decor, its own arrangement of furniture, they all carried the same essential emptiness. A bed too large for one person, a window overlooking streets she scarcely had time to walk, a telephone on the nightstand that seemed more silent than alive. She would sometimes wait for it to ring, staring at it as though willing a voice to appear on the line. When it remained still, she sighed, lay back on the bed, and listened instead to the distant murmur of strangers passing below. Loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of connection, and Marilyn was surrounded by people who adored her, but seldom reached her. Crowds gathered at theaters, fans pressed forward for autographs, journalists clamored for quotes. Everywhere she went, she was followed by eyes. Yet few looked beyond the mask, beyond the blonde hair and painted lips, beyond the smile that had been rehearsed into perfection. She was loved for what she represented, but seldom for who she was. This was the paradox of her existence, to be seen by millions and yet unseen in the only way that mattered. Friends noticed how she moved between extremes. In public, she could summon Marilyn with a tilt of the head, a flutter of lashes, a breathy laugh that seemed to open every heart around her. In private, she would retreat into silence, curling into herself, hesitant even to speak. She confessed often that she feared people would abandon her if they truly knew her, and so she gave them the performance they desired. But with each performance, the distance between her inner self and her public image widened until she no longer knew which one was real. Was she Norma Jeane, the fragile child who longed for permanence, or was she Marilyn Monroe, the myth adored by millions? Or had the two become so entangled that neither could stand alone? In these years, she tried to form circles of trust. She kept close a few friends who listened without judgment, who allowed her to speak freely of her doubts. Yet even among them, she sometimes withdrew, uncertain if she could truly reveal herself without fear of rejection. The past haunted her still. Every failed romance, every abandoned childhood home, every note of dismissal whispered that she might never be enough. And so, even in company, she remained a little apart, like a star visible in the night sky yet untouchable from the ground. The telephone became a symbol of her longing. She would sit by it sometimes for hours, waiting for a call that might never come. When it did ring, she answered with breathless eagerness, her voice bright, her words rushing forth as though afraid the connection might vanish. When it did not, she stared at the silent device as though it were a mirror of her own solitude. To live in such anticipation is to live in constant ache, a cycle of hope and disappointment that wears upon the soul. And yet, amid this loneliness, she continued to give the world her art. Films like Some Like It Hot in 1959 revealed her brilliance, her ability to turn comedy into something layered with poignancy. She was radiant, luminous, unforgettable. Audiences laughed, critics praised, directors marveled at her instinctive timing. On screen, she seemed to embody joy itself. But behind the scenes, the same fragility returned. Lateness, exhaustion, hesitation. These contradictions became fodder for gossip columns, which painted her as unreliable, difficult, even unstable. What they could not see was the courage it took for her to rise each morning, to put on the mask, to step once again into the glare of lights, when her inner self longed only for rest. The loneliness of fame was amplified by its demands. Every appearance required perfection. Every photograph had to flatter. Every word risked distortion in the press. She lived under constant scrutiny, every gesture magnified, every stumble broadcast. There was no refuge, no space to be ordinary, no room to be human. And so, she retreated further into herself, finding in solitude a kind of fragile safety, even as it deepened her ache. At times she sought escape in brief affairs, hoping for intimacy to soothe the void. For a night, perhaps, she felt cherished, held, chosen. But mornings often brought distance, and with it the return of emptiness. She yearned for more than momentary affection. She longed for permanence, for love that endured beyond passion, beyond image. Yet permanence had always eluded her. From childhood onward, and each disappointment confirmed her deepest fear, that she was destined to be adored, but never truly loved. The image that lingers from this chapter is of a hotel telephone, its cord coiled neatly, its body silent. Beside it sits a notepad with doodles and scribbled words, half-formed sentences written in moments of waiting. The lamp casts a small pool of light upon the scene, but beyond that pool the room is dim, empty, echoing with silence. The world outside may roar with applause, but here, within these walls, the only sound is the soft hum of loneliness, constant and unrelenting. The phone remains still, its silence pressing heavily upon the night. From this silence, we step forward into another realm, for in the midst of her loneliness, Marilyn reached toward power itself, finding herself entangled with men whose names shaped nations. The stage of her life widened beyond Hollywood, stretching into the banquet halls of politics, where the allure of intimacy with power offered both danger and fascination. The telephone rests silently upon the nightstand, its coiled cord still, its body untouched. From this silence, the scene shifts, and the quiet of lonely hotel rooms gives way to banquet halls filled with murmurs, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Here, Marilyn Monroe stepped not only among actors and directors, but among men whose names carried the weight of nations. Political power, with its allure and its danger, brushed against her life, and the whispers of her connections would echo long after she was gone. It was in the glittering atmosphere of galas and fundraisers that Marilyn first crossed paths with those who lived in the orbit of politics. Senators, presidents, advisors, all drawn to her as though she were a flame, and they moths compelled to circle it. Among them were the Kennedy brothers, John and Robert, whose prominence in American history would soon become entwined with her story. To the world, they were men of influence and vision, symbols of a new era of hope. To her, perhaps, they were also simply men, attentive and charming, capable of offering the intimacy she so desperately craved. The settings of these encounters were often lavish. A long table set with white cloth and gleaming silverware, candles flickering in the half-dark, the air rich with perfume and cigar smoke. Laughter rippled across the hall as powerful men exchanged jokes, their words cloaked in charm, but sharpened with ambition. Marilyn, seated among them, was luminous even in stillness, her beauty unmatched, her presence impossible to ignore. She smiled, she listened, She leaned in when spoken to, and the room seemed to lean toward her in return. Yet beneath the glitter, there was unease. For intimacy with power is never free of shadows, and rumors cling to it like smoke. Some whispered that she had affairs with one or both of the brothers. Others claimed she knew secrets too heavy for her to bear, secrets spoken in the soft vulnerability of private hours. Whether true or exaggerated, the effect was the same. Marilyn found herself caught in a web of fascination and suspicion, admired not only for her beauty, but feared for what she might know. For Marilyn, such encounters may have carried another meaning. To sit at the side of presidents and senators was to feel, at last, that she mattered beyond the confines of Hollywood, that she was more than an image. Here were men whose decisions shaped nations, and they were captivated by her. Did she feel in those moments that she had transcended the loneliness of hotel rooms, that she had finally been chosen not only as a fantasy, but as a confidant? Or did she sense, even then, the fragility of such connections, the likelihood that she was once again a guest in a story that was not her own? Her friends recalled her speaking of these encounters with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She felt flattered by the attention, drawn to the warmth of their charm, yet she also feared what might come of it. She knew too well the cruelty of gossip, the veracity of the press, the ease with which a woman could be reduced to scandal. Still, she reached out, as she always had, hoping for intimacy, for permanence, even as she sensed the danger. The press, of course, knew nothing certain, but speculation thrives on uncertainty. Reporters began to hint, to suggest, to weave narratives of Marilyn entangled with the Kennedys. The whispers grew louder, never proven, never silenced. Even decades later, the truth remains veiled, and perhaps it does not matter whether the rumors were fact or fiction. What matters is the way they colored her final years, adding another layer of tension, another shadow pressing upon her fragile spirit. To imagine her in those banquet halls is to see a figure both radiant and haunted. She laughs, the sound like music, yet her eyes wander when unobserved, as though searching for something beyond the crowd. She sips from her glass, the liquid reflecting the candlelight, but her hand trembles slightly. Around her, voices speak of policies, of futures, of strategies, while she drifts between the role of guest and symbol, present and absent, all at once. The candle flame flickering at the edge of the banquet table becomes the lasting image of this chapter. It wavers in the current of air, bending, almost extinguishing, yet holding on. Like Marilyn, it shines in the moment, fragile but radiant, illuminating faces even as it struggles against the shadows pressing around it. To those seated nearby, it is simply part of the atmosphere, unnoticed. But to us, watching from a distance, it is a metaphor for her entire being, luminous, delicate, precarious, and as the banquet ends, as the guests drift away into waiting cars, as the candles burn down to their stubs, Marilyn returns once more to her solitude. The laughter fades, the perfume of the hall lingers only faintly upon her dress, and she is left again with herself, her questions, her longing. Was she cherished for who she was, or merely admired as a fleeting star in another's orbit? Did these men truly see her, or did they see only the myth they wished to touch for a moment? The candle flame wavers one last time, then steadies, and from this fragile light we move onward into a night more famous than any banquet, when Marilyn stepped upon a stage in Madison Square Garden and sang a song that the world has never forgotten, her voice carrying both allure and sorrow into the ears of a president. The candle flame wavers one last time, then steadies, its glow lingering in the banquet hall even as the guests drift away into the night. From this flicker of light, we move into another night, far larger, far brighter, where the stage itself became the center of a nation's gaze. It is May of 1962, Madison Square Garden in New York City, the air electric with anticipation. The hall is filled with thousands, their voices mingling like the hum of a restless ocean. And then, through the hush, she appears. Marilyn Monroe, shimmering in a gown that seemed made of liquid light, ready to sing the most famous birthday song the world would ever hear. The dress itself was a marvel, sewn with thousands of rhinestones that clung to her body like a second skin, so delicate and translucent that it gave the illusion she wore nothing at all. When she stepped into the spotlight, the audience gasped, for she did not walk but glowed, every facet of the fabric scattering light in dazzling waves. She was fragile and radiant all at once, a vision both angelic and forbidden. For a moment, the President, John F. Kennedy, and every guest gathered there seemed to hold their breath, as though time itself paused to watch her. She took the microphone in her hand, hesitated just long enough for silence to settle, then began in her soft, breathy voice, "Happy birthday to you." It was not simply a song, but an intimate whisper carried across the vast hall, as though she were singing not to the thousands present, not to the millions who would read about it, but to one man alone. Each note seemed fragile, trembling, yet filled with a sensuality that made the crowd lean forward. When she finished, laughter and applause erupted, but beneath it there was unease, a recognition that something unusual, even scandalous, had just taken place in plain sight. The performance lasted less than a minute, yet it has endured for decades. The newspapers the next day were filled with photographs of her, the glittering dress, the president smiling beside her. Some called it bold, others inappropriate, but all agreed it was unforgettable. The song became more than a moment of celebration. It became a symbol of Marilyn's entanglement with power, a whisper of intimacy that the world would never stop speculating about. And yet, for Marilyn herself, what did it mean? Perhaps it was another performance, another mask, another way of giving the world what it expected. Perhaps it was also an attempt to be more than a star, to step into history by standing beside the most powerful man in America. Or perhaps it was simply a gesture of vulnerability, a lonely woman offering a song in the only way she knew, softly, tenderly, with a trace of sorrow hidden in the laughter. Backstage, after the applause, the air was different. The corridors were narrow, the lighting dim, the voices hushed. Marilyn, still wrapped in the shimmering gown, walked slowly, her heels echoing against the concrete floor. The roar of the crowd behind her faded with each step, replaced by the ordinary clatter of stagehands moving props, the cough of a technician, the slam of a distant door. She was no longer in the blaze of the spotlight, but in the shadows once again, where her fragility returned. The gown glittered still, but in the dimness, its brilliance seemed out of place, almost sad, like a jewel abandoned in the dust. Friends who were there recalled her unease. She smiled for the cameras, but afterward she seemed withdrawn, as though the performance had drained her. The gown was carefully removed, packed away, preserved, while Marilyn sat in silence staring at the floor, her hands clasped together. Perhaps she wondered whether she had given too much of herself, whether the intimacy of her song would be twisted into gossip, whether she would ever be able to step away from the image she had created. Indeed, the gossip did not wait. Whispers spread quickly, that she and the president were lovers, that her song was more than a performance, that she was entangled in secrets too delicate for the public eye. Whether truth or rumor, the effect was the same. Marilyn became not only an actress, but a symbol of scandal, her name now linked with the highest office in the land. The burden of such rumors weighed heavily upon her, for she knew too well how swiftly adoration could turn to condemnation, how easily love could dissolve into rejection. The image of that night remains etched in memory. Marilyn on the vast stage, her voice trembling yet irresistible, her gown shimmering like starlight. To the audience, it was unforgettable. To history, it was symbolic. To her, it may have been only another moment of giving, another attempt to matter, another performance that left her emptier than before. As she walked down the backstage corridors, the echo of applause still lingering faintly in the distance, one wonders what she felt. Did she feel triumph, having captivated even the president? Did she feel fear, knowing the whispers would grow louder? Or did she feel simply tired, longing only to return to a quiet room, to draw the curtains, to rest? The answer remains unspoken. What we know is that the night became a turning point, a moment that forever tied her name to a story larger than Hollywood, a story of power, politics, and mystery. From then on, the shadows that surrounded her grew darker, the eyes that watched her sharper, the silence in her private rooms heavier. The echo of applause fades completely now, swallowed by the dark corridors behind the stage. Only the faint shimmer of the gown remains, glistening in the dim light, as though reluctant to let go of the brilliance it once reflected. From this shimmer, we move into the next chapter, where Marilyn found herself increasingly surrounded not by adoring crowds, but by whispers in the shadows, rumors of surveillance, the watchful eyes of men who feared what she knew and who listened even when she did not speak. The gown shimmers faintly in the dim backstage corridor, reluctant to release its captured light. And as it fades, the brilliance of the stage is replaced by shadows, by whispers, by the quiet unease of unseen eyes. For after that famous night at Madison Square Garden, Marilyn Monroe's life seemed increasingly surrounded not by applause, but by silence that listened, by corridors without faces, by cars idling at the edge of darkness. She was no longer only the star adored by millions, but also a figure watched, suspected, perhaps feared, for what she knew or what others believed she might know. The rumors of her entanglement with power spread quickly, and with them came suspicions. Was she only a companion at banquets and gatherings, or was she also privy to conversations meant to remain hidden? Did she hear secrets spoken in unguarded moments, secrets whispered not to Marilyn the actress, but to the woman who sat close, whose attention felt intimate, whose silence seemed trustworthy? Whether she carried such knowledge or not hardly mattered, for those who feared her believed she did. And fear is enough to turn admiration into scrutiny, affection into surveillance. She began to notice small signs, though whether they were real or imagined is impossible to know. The click upon lifting a telephone, as though another line were listening. The sensation of being watched from a parked car at night. Headlights dimmed, the engine murmuring softly as she passed. The questions asked too casually by acquaintances. The rumors that returned to her distorted, as though her own words had been carried away by unseen messengers. To live under such conditions is to live in a state of unease, where every silence becomes suspicious, every shadow a possible observer. Marilyn, already fragile, felt the strain deeply. Privacy had long been denied her by fame, but now it was not only the public gaze she endured, it was the hidden gaze, the one that never declared itself, the one that never slept. Friends recalled her growing paranoia, her suspicion that her home was tapped, that her conversations were recorded. Perhaps it was true, perhaps it was only fear, but for a woman who had spent her entire life uncertain of who to trust, such suspicions were poison. They deepened her loneliness, isolated her further, and made the night seem even darker than before. The irony was cruel. The more she longed for intimacy, the more dangerous intimacy became. To trust meant to risk betrayal. To speak meant to risk exposure. And so, she found herself caught between silence and confession, unable to remain entirely in either, forever uncertain which path would keep her safe. The pills that lined her nightstands became not only a refuge from sleeplessness, but a refuge from this gnawing anxiety, the only way to quiet a mind that feared both loneliness and betrayal. Yet even in this atmosphere of suspicion, she continued to work, continued to perform, continued to give to the world what the world demanded. Her laughter still echoed in films, her beauty still graced magazines, her name still drew crowds. To the audience, she remained luminous, but beneath the surface, the shadows pressed closer, and the woman who once glowed with promise now felt herself diminished by the weight of unseen eyes. It is difficult even now to know where truth ends and rumor begins. Did agencies truly monitor her, fearing that she knew too much of the Kennedys, too much of political affairs? Did the mafia, entangled in its own web of influence, seek to keep her close or to silence her? Or were these only the imaginings of a woman overwhelmed by loneliness and fame, her fears magnified by her own fragility? The ambiguity itself is part of her story, for Marilyn's life was always suspended between truth and myth, reality and fantasy, her existence forever clouded by the haze of speculation. The image of her during these years is not one of glamour, but of solitude. She stands at a window with the curtains drawn tightly, the city lights outside muffled by heavy fabric. She holds the edge of the curtain with one hand, peering through a narrow gap, her breath shallow, her eyes searching the street below. A car is parked there, or perhaps she only thinks it is. A shadow moves, or perhaps it is only the wind. She lets the curtain fall back into place, shutting out both light and suspicion, retreating once more into the dim safety of her room. This constant tension eroded her further. The woman who had once longed for the world's gaze now found it unbearable, invasive, suffocating. Fame had promised her love and permanence, but it had given her scrutiny and isolation. The applause that once lifted her now seemed distant, hollow, irrelevant against the pressure of secrets and rumors that circled like vultures. She was adored and feared, admired and suspected, held up as a dream and treated as a liability. Such contradictions would break even the strongest spirit. For Marilyn, already fragile, they were unbearable. And yet she endured, at least for a time. She laughed still at parties. She smiled for cameras. She rehearsed for films. She wrote in her notebooks of her fears and hopes. Within her remained the child who had always survived, who had always found a way to endure even when abandoned, even when unseen. But survival carries its own cost, and with each passing year, the cost grew heavier. The drawn curtain remains, shutting out the world, blocking both moonlight and gaze. It is the symbol of her life at this point, closed off, hidden, fearful, yet still fragile, still beautiful behind the veil. From this curtain, we move onward into the final weeks of her life, when restlessness and fragility deepened into inevitability, when the ticking of a clock seemed louder than any applause, and when the shadows that surrounded her pressed in too closely to be ignored. The curtain falls back into place, shutting out both moonlight and gaze, sealing her once more inside her own fragile silence. From this closed room, we step into the final weeks of her life, when restlessness and fragility deepened, when every sound in the house seemed louder than it was, and when the ticking of the clock pressed upon her as though time itself were reminding her of its relentless passage. It was the summer of 1962, and Marilyn was 36. The world still adored her, still printed her image on magazine covers, still spoke her name with fascination. Yet her private days were marked by uncertainty, exhaustion, and the gnawing sense that something inevitable was drawing near. She had recently moved into a modest home in Brentwood, white-walled and sunlit on the outside, though within its rooms shadows seemed to gather in corners. She had tried to make it a refuge, a place of her own after so many years of transience, but even there she could not escape the restlessness that lived within her. The house bore witness to her nights. Scattered papers lay across tables, notebooks filled with reflections, fragments of poems, unfinished letters. She wrote of her fears, her loneliness, her longing for peace. The handwriting itself betrayed her mood, sometimes neat and steady, sometimes hurried and jagged, as though her thoughts were rushing too quickly to be contained. Books lay open on armrests, beside pillows, on the floor. She read with intensity, as though searching in the words of others for an answer that eluded her own. Sleep was difficult. The pill bottles multiplied upon her nightstand, different prescriptions for different needs, some to calm, some to ease her into rest, some to bring her back to wakefulness. The cycle had become routine, and yet it never truly worked. Nights stretched long, filled with tossing, with turning, with hours spent staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the only sound. At times she would rise, wander through the house, stand at windows though the curtains were drawn, pace slowly across the carpet until fatigue forced her back to bed. Visitors came and went during those weeks, friends, colleagues, sometimes lovers. To each she presented a different face, laughter and warmth to some, weariness and sorrow to others. She was never without charm, never without that vulnerability that made people lean toward her, wanting to comfort her, to hold her. Yet even those closest to her confessed that she seemed distant, as though part of her mind remained elsewhere, unreachable. She was present, and yet not fully there, her spirit restless even in company. Her career, too, was in uncertainty. She had been dismissed from Something's Got to Give earlier that summer, the studio weary of her lateness, her absences, her difficulties on set. For Marilyn, this was both humiliation and grief, for work was not only livelihood, but also the last thread of her identity, the place where she could still give something to the world. Rumors of her instability grew, the press eager to paint her as fading, broken, unreliable. She felt the sting of these words, though she tried to hide it, tried to tell herself that she could return, that she could still rise again. But doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps she had already given all she could. The ticking of the clock grew louder in those weeks, as though the house itself reminded her of time's indifference. Each hour struck with clarity, echoing through the quiet rooms. At night, when she lay awake, the sound became unbearable, a reminder that rest would not come, that morning would arrive with its own demands. She sometimes covered her ears with pillows, but still she heard it, steady, relentless, indifferent. Those who saw her in this period remember small details that seemed insignificant at the time, but haunting in retrospect. The way she lingered on goodbyes, holding a friend's hand a little longer than usual. The way she spoke of peace, of wishing only for quiet, of longing for release from the strain of being Marilyn Monroe. The way she seemed both hopeful for the future and resigned to an end. Contradictions, as always, defined her. The woman who laughed brightly even when despair weighed upon her heart. The woman who dreamed of new roles even as she contemplated endings. One wonders whether she sensed what was coming, whether she felt it approaching like a tide too strong to resist. Perhaps she did not think of it consciously, but the atmosphere around her seemed charged with inevitability. The shadows lengthened in her life, not with sudden drama, but with the slow accumulation of sleepless nights, of scattered pills, of relentless scrutiny. The child who once waited at the orphanage gate for someone to come now waited in her Brentwood home, though what she waited for even she might not have known. The image that lingers is of her writing desk in those final weeks. Papers scattered, notebooks half-filled, a pen lying across a page unfinished, the curtains drawn, the lamp casting a small circle of light, the rest of the room fading into shadow. Outside, the world bustled with life, traffic, laughter, sunlight, Yet within the room, time seemed to stand still, the clock ticking louder than any sound beyond the walls. The pen remains on the page, the ink drying slowly, the sentence left incomplete. From this unfinished word, we move into the fateful night itself, when the doors of her house would close, when phone calls would go unanswered, and when the world would awaken to the shocking news that the brightest star of Hollywood had been extinguished in silence. The pen rests upon the unfinished page, its ink drying slowly, the words halted mid-thought, and from this silence we enter the night of August the 4th, 1962. It was an ordinary Saturday in Los Angeles, the air still heavy with summer warmth, the streets quieting after the long brightness of the day. But within the small white house in Brentwood, time seemed to move differently, suspended in a haze of pills, telephone calls, and closed doors. The world beyond continued unaware, yet within those walls a final chapter was being written, invisible, silent, irreversible. Marilyn spent much of that day in her bedroom. Friends who spoke to her earlier recalled her voice as soft, tired, sometimes distracted. She telephoned a few acquaintances, arranged meetings that would never occur, spoke of the future as though it were still unfolding. To her psychiatrist, she expressed restlessness, unease, the sense that she was surrounded by shadows. To others, she sounded cheerful, even hopeful, as though rehearsing a different version of herself. This was her way, contradictory, complex, impossible to reduce to a single mood. Visitors came and went in those hours. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, moved quietly through the rooms, tending to chores, checking upon her. A photographer arrived earlier in the day for a brief session, capturing images that would later feel unbearably poignant, the last glimpses of her alive. She smiled, she posed, she allowed the lens to capture her as she had so many times before. And yet in her eyes, those who looked closely claimed to see a shadow, a distance, as though part of her was already slipping away. As evening descended, Marilyn retreated more fully into solitude. The curtains in her bedroom were drawn, shutting out the last light of the setting sun. On her nightstand rested the familiar array of pill bottles, their labels blurred with repetition, their contents dwindling. A lamp glowed softly in the corner, casting the room into a dim half-light. The telephone lay nearby, its receiver heavy, its silence oppressive. She spoke once more to a friend, her words lingering on the line, and then no further calls were answered. Outside, Los Angeles continued in its restless rhythm. Radios played, cars rolled down boulevards, couples walked beneath neon signs. But inside the Brentwood home, silence thickened. Hours passed. Eunice Murray grew uneasy, sensing something wrong. She knocked gently upon the bedroom door, but there was no response. She tried again, more firmly calling Marilyn's name. Still silence. Fear tightened its grip, and she telephoned Marilyn's doctor. Together, they returned to the door, finding it locked from within. At last, they broke it open, and the scene revealed itself. Marilyn lying upon the bed, motionless, the telephone receiver in her hand, as though she had reached for connection even in her final moment. The room was still. The lamp glowed faintly, illuminating the bottles on the nightstand, the half-drawn sheets, the pale figure of the woman who had once lit screens across the world. The telephone rested against her palm, its cord coiled loosely across the bed, silent, disconnected, as though the conversation she longed for had ended before it began. Outside, sirens wailed as the news spread, drawing near like a lament. The house, once a refuge, became at that moment a shrine, a stage for the end of an era. The official reports declared it an overdose, a probable suicide. The coroner's words were clinical, precise, stripped of the sorrow that filled the room. Yet from the moment of her discovery, doubt began to stir. Some whispered of accident, others of conspiracy. Was it despair that drove her, or a careless miscalculation, or the hand of others unseen? The truth lay hidden in the silence of that night, a silence that no investigation could ever fully penetrate. What we know is this: the brightest star of Hollywood, the woman who had risen from orphanage corridors to the pinnacle of fame, was gone. She was 36, an age both young and yet heavy with the weariness of a life lived under relentless scrutiny. Her passing sent shock through the world, headlines blaring across continents, fans weeping in the streets, colleagues stunned into disbelief. It seemed impossible that the woman who had embodied vitality, allure, and vulnerability could vanish so suddenly, so quietly, so alone. And yet perhaps it was always inevitable. For years she had spoken of her loneliness, her exhaustion, her longing for rest. She had lived at the edge of fragility, balancing beauty with sorrow, applause with silence. The pills had become her refuge, and on that final night they became her undoing. Whether by choice or by chance, the result was the same. The silence that had haunted her throughout her life at last became absolute. The image of that night endures. The closed bedroom door, the unanswered knocks, the telephone resting against her hand, the sirens wailing in the distance. It is an image not of glamour, but of tragedy, not of myth, but of mortality. The woman who had once drawn laughter and tears from millions lay in stillness, her voice silenced, her smile extinguished, and yet even in death she remained luminous, for the world refused to let her go. The sirens fade now into the distance, their cry lingering like a lament across the sleeping city. The house stands quiet once more, its rooms emptied of presence, its walls bearing only the echo of what is past. And from this stillness we step forward into the aftermath, when the world, hungry for answers, sought explanations that could not be found, when the official ruling of suicide was met not with acceptance, but with endless doubt and speculation. The sirens fade into the night, their wail dissolving into the silence of Brentwood, leaving behind the stillness of a house that had become a tomb. From this stillness we step into the aftermath, when the world, shocked awake, sought explanations that words could not truly give. Official voices were swift to speak, clinical in their pronouncements, but the murmurs of doubt rose at once, mingling with grief, refusing to be silenced. Police arrived to find the scene as described: Marilyn Monroe lying upon her bed, the telephone in her hand, the nightstand cluttered with bottles whose labels told the story of her struggle. They cataloged the objects, took photographs, questioned those present. Their language was precise, stripped of the awe that her name inspired in millions. To them, it was a case to be recorded, a tragedy to be filed, another life extinguished by the merciless hand of despair. The coroner soon gave his conclusion: probable suicide, death by overdose of barbiturates. The words were cold, factual, final, yet they satisfied almost no one. Journalists gathered like moths to the flame. Outside the Brentwood home, cameras flashed, not with the joyous hunger of premieres, but with the morbid fascination of loss. Reporters scribbled hastily into notebooks. Telephone wires carried the news across oceans. Headlines were prepared for the morning editions. Marilyn Monroe dead at 36, the papers declared, their bold letters carrying shock into every household. Fans wept in the streets, their grief raw, their disbelief unshaken by the certainty of print. How could the woman who had been life itself, laughter, beauty, vulnerability, be silenced so suddenly? The official ruling of suicide seemed both obvious and unthinkable. Obvious because her struggles were well known: the pills, the sleepless nights, the loneliness. Unthinkable because she had still spoken of the future, had made plans, had dreamed of new beginnings. Those who loved her clung to these contradictions, unwilling to accept that she might have chosen the silence that had haunted her all her life. Doubt became the natural refuge of grief, and speculation began to grow. Friends who had spoken to her that very evening insisted she had not sounded desperate. She had spoken of projects, of possibilities, of small joys yet to come. Others remembered her fragility, her weariness, her history of despair. Each voice added another thread to the tapestry until the story of her final hours became not one story but many, each colored by memory, by perspective, by need. The truth slipped away in the cacophony, leaving only questions. The investigators, for their part, were hurried. Some details of the scene were recorded inconsistently. Some testimony shifted in the telling. Some evidence seemed incomplete. These gaps, whether born of negligence or of something more deliberate, became the soil in which rumors flourished. Did she take the pills willingly, or were they given? Did she call for help, only to be silenced by those who feared what she might reveal? Did she die alone, or was someone there in the room, unseen in the official record? Each question remained unanswered, each answer tangled in speculation. The press fed eagerly upon these doubts. Articles whispered of conspiracies, of hidden hands, of secrets too dangerous to survive. Some pointed to her connections with the Kennedys, suggesting she had known too much, spoken too freely. Others invoked the mafia, the studios, shadowy figures who might have wanted her silenced. Still others insisted it was accident, the tragic miscalculation of a woman too accustomed to fragile remedies. And in the midst of these speculations, the woman herself was lost, her voice drowned beneath the noise of others. Yet perhaps this was always her fate. Marilyn Monroe had always lived between image and reality, between truth and myth. Even in death, she was denied the simplicity of certainty. Her passing became not an ending, but a beginning of endless stories, each claiming to explain, none fully convincing. The official words, probable suicide, remain written in records, but the heart resists them, for the heart remembers her laughter, her hope, her fragility. The heart insists there must be more. In those days after her death, the world mourned visibly. Crowds gathered at her funeral, roses laid upon her coffin, tears shed openly. Yet even as grief poured out, curiosity pressed forward. People asked not only why, but also how, and by whom. It is the nature of mystery to haunt us more deeply than clarity, and Marilyn's death was mystery incarnate, wrapped in scandal, wrapped in silence. Imagine for a moment the scene of a reporter in those days. He sits at his desk, typewriter before him, the newsroom buzzing with urgency. He writes quickly, the keys clacking, sentences forming into headlines. He pauses, hesitates, his finger hovering above a key. He knows what the officials have declared, but he also hears the whispers, the doubts, the inconsistencies. He begins to type another sentence, but then stops, uncertain. His typewriter falls silent mid-word, just as her pen had upon the unfinished page. This is the lasting image of the aftermath, a typewriter halting mid-sentence, the truth unfinished, incomplete, suspended between fact and rumor. The keys remain still, the ribbon inked but unused, the words unsaid. From this silence of the machine, we move into deeper speculation, into the labyrinth of conspiracies that would surround her name forever. Conspiracies of politics, of hidden documents, of secrets locked away in briefcases that have never been opened. The typewriter halts mid-sentence, its keys frozen above the page, and from this silence we descend into the labyrinth of speculation that grew in the wake of her death. For if the coroner's words were final, the voices of the world were not. They whispered of secrets, of politics, of hidden files and briefcases locked away in rooms where light seldom entered. Marilyn Monroe, the actress who had once been only a child yearning for love, was now entangled in the machinery of rumor that bound her fate not only to Hollywood, but to the nation itself. Her connections to the Kennedys became the heart of these conspiracies. The night at Madison Square Garden, the candlelight of banquets, the laughter shared in private conversations, all became magnified, distorted, retold as evidence that she had stepped too close to power. Some claimed she had been privy to confidential matters, that pillow talk had revealed to her details of state that she was never meant to know. Others said she had threatened to speak out, to reveal what she had heard, to publish her own account. Whether true or not, such stories spread swiftly, carried by the hunger of a public unwilling to accept that her end was merely personal despair. The idea that she knew too much became irresistible. Could it be that her death was not a surrender, but a silencing? That those who smiled at her in public feared her in private and decided that the risk of her voice was greater than the cost of her absence? No proof was ever found, yet absence of proof is fertile soil for imagination. Files classified, testimonies inconsistent, timelines blurred, all contributed to the sense that something lay beneath the surface, something that official words would never confess. Investigators, both official and amateur, returned again and again to the details of that night. The locked door, the telephone in her hand, the housekeeper's shifting accounts, the doctor's uncertain testimony. The speed with which the scene was declared settled, the inconsistencies in reports, the missing records, each detail, small in itself, became magnified into significance until the picture of her death was no longer one of tragic solitude, but of unseen hands guiding the silence. And then there were the notebooks, the fragments of her thoughts left scattered across her home. Some pages spoke of hope, others of despair. Still others hinted at knowledge too vague to interpret, but too suggestive to ignore. Did she write of secrets entrusted to her? Did she plan to reveal them? Or were these merely the reflections of a restless mind, seeking meaning in words, as she always had? To those who believed in conspiracy, the notebooks became evidence. To others, they were simply the diary of a woman struggling with her own fragility. The locked briefcase became the most enduring symbol of these suspicions. It was said that she kept papers, letters, perhaps recordings, hidden within, evidence of the powerful lives that had intersected with hers. Some claimed it was taken the night she died, spirited away before the police arrived. Others denied it had ever existed. Yet the image endures. A dark leather case, placed beneath a bed or within a closet, its clasp sealed, its contents unknown. Whether real or imagined, it embodies the uncertainty that has always surrounded her. An object both absent and present, a silence that cannot be opened. In the years that followed, books were written, testimonies given, theories multiplied. Some insisted it was the Kennedys who wished her silenced, fearing scandal or exposure. Others pointed to the mafia, whose own entanglements with politics and Hollywood made her a dangerous liability. Still others returned to the simplest explanation, that her death was her own, the culmination of years of sorrow and exhaustion. Each theory carried its own logic, its own evidence, its own adherents. None erased the others. The truth remained suspended, unreachable, as though locked in the briefcase itself. What makes these conspiracies so enduring is not only the possibility of hidden hands, but the impossibility of accepting simplicity. Marilyn Monroe was not a simple figure. Her life was a tapestry of contradictions, her presence a mixture of glamour and vulnerability, myth and reality. To believe that her end was only an accident or a lonely choice feels inadequate, unworthy of the woman she had become. The world insists there must be more, that her story must be as mysterious as her gaze, as complex as her smile. And so the theories persist, each generation adding its own layer to the myth. But perhaps the real mystery lies not in the hidden files or the silenced voices, but in the way her life itself defied clarity. She was always both seen and unseen, loved and abandoned, desired and dismissed. Even in death, she could not be contained within a single narrative. The conspiracies in their endless variations are only the continuation of the contradictions that defined her. The image that lingers is of the locked briefcase, its leather worn, its clasp firm. It sits in a room dim with dust, the air heavy with the weight of secrets. We do not know if it was ever truly there or if it still remains hidden somewhere, untouched, unopened. But in imagination, it exists, and its silence is louder than any revelation could be. For within that silence lies all the unanswered questions, all the doubts, all the shadows that continue to haunt her story. The briefcase remains unopened, its silence absolute. From this silence, we move onward into another set of whispers, not of presidents and politics, but of underworld figures, of smoky bars and heavy cigars, of the mafia whose presence in Hollywood was as pervasive as the shadows in Marilyn's life, and whose name, too, has been tied to the mystery of her death. The briefcase remains unopened, its silence absolute, and from that silence we move into darker rooms, where smoke hangs heavy in the air and laughter comes not from joy, but from menace. These were the places of rumor, the underworld ties that entwined with Hollywood and politics alike, the realm of the mafia whose shadow reached further than most dared to admit. And into these shadows, too, Marilyn Monroe's story was drawn, her name whispered in the same breath as theirs, her fate speculated upon as though it were part of their dangerous game. The mafia of mid-century America was not confined to back alleys and hidden cellars. Its influence extended into unions, into nightclubs, into the very machinery of entertainment. Stars mingled with figures whose wealth came not from cameras, but from crime, their presence tolerated, even courted in the glittering circles of fame. It was said that Marilyn, through her friendships and her loves, came into contact with men who stood at the edge of this world, men whose names carried weight in both Hollywood and the streets. Whether by chance or by design, her path brushed against theirs, and the rumors that followed painted her as a pawn in struggles far larger than herself. Some claimed she was a link between worlds, between politicians and criminals, between presidents and mob bosses. Others whispered that she knew too much, not only of politics, but of underworld dealings, secrets shared in careless moments, fragments of conversations overheard at parties where champagne blurred discretion. In truth, no one could ever say with certainty what she knew, but the very suggestion was enough to make her name dangerous, to make her presence a risk for those whose survival depended upon silence. The imagery of this rumor is vivid. A dim bar, the haze of cigars curling upward toward a ceiling fan that spins lazily, the clink of ice in glasses as men in dark suits speak in low tones. Laughter erupts suddenly, sharp and heavy, masking threats in its rhythm. A name is mentioned, Marilyn, followed by silence, by a glance, by the tightening of lips around a cigar. Perhaps this is all imagination, the dramatization of gossip, or perhaps it is closer to truth than we can ever know. For the mafia thrived not only in crime, but in secrecy, and secrecy is fertile ground for myth. What is certain is that after her death, voices began to point toward these shadows. Some insisted she had been silenced because she threatened to reveal connections between politics and organized crime. Others argued that her death was used as a warning, a symbol to others of the reach and power of men who never appeared in photographs, but whose influence extended into every corner of the city. Still others dismissed it all as fantasy, the inevitable weaving of conspiracy around a figure too luminous to be explained by ordinary tragedy. For Marilyn herself, such rumors were perhaps unknown, or perhaps only faintly sensed. She was never a strategist, never a conspirator. She was, above all, a seeker of love, of permanence, of meaning. If she brushed against dangerous circles, it was not out of ambition, but out of longing for companionship, for recognition, for the comfort of powerful arms around her fragile self. And yet, longing can lead one into peril, and those who seek intimacy sometimes stumble into webs spun for other purposes. The mafia rumors, whether real or imagined, deepened the sense that her life was never wholly her own. Even in death, she seemed to be claimed by forces larger than herself, forces that used her name as currency, as evidence, as warning. She became not only a woman, but a symbol, her body and her story manipulated by those who wished to shape narratives of power. The girl who once stood at an orphanage window waiting for someone to come had grown into a woman whose very silence was contested, whose death was debated not only by friends but by strangers who had never known her. And yet, within this swirl of rumor, her humanity risks being lost. To speak of her as entangled in mafia plots is to forget the quiet rooms where she wrote in her notebooks, the lonely nights when she waited by a silent telephone, the vulnerability that shone through her laughter on screen. Perhaps the mafia touched her story, perhaps not. But what cannot be denied is that she remained, to the very end, a woman seeking tenderness, caught in a world that offered instead suspicion, control, and endless scrutiny. Still, the image persists. The smoky room, the clink of ice melting in a glass, the sudden hush when her name is spoken. It is an image not of certainty but of possibility, of the shadows that cling to her memory and refuse to fade. Whether those shadows conceal truth or merely fear, they remain, part of the eternal mystery that surrounds her. The glass sits upon the table, its ice melting slowly, the liquid within darkening as the cubes dissolve. Around it, voices murmur, whispers fade into silence, and the room grows still. From this fading sound, we move into yet another realm, not of conspiracy, not of danger, but of reflection. For beyond the rumors, beyond the suspicions, there remains the question of legacy, of how Marilyn Monroe has endured not merely as a star, but as a myth, a woman whose image has outlived her, whose smile still gazes from posters, whose grave is still covered in roses. The glass sits upon the table, its ice melting slowly, the liquid darkening as the cubes dissolve. The laughter and whispers have faded, the smoke has thinned, and in the silence that follows, we are drawn away from the shadows of conspiracy and into the softer light of remembrance. For beyond the speculation, beyond the questions that may never find answers, there remains the enduring truth of Marilyn Monroe's legacy, the way her image lingers upon the world like perfume in an empty room, the way her presence continues long after the sound of her voice has ceased. Her films, though bound to their era, remain alive. On screens large and small, her smile still flashes, her voice still lilts with that strange blend of innocence and desire, her gestures still carry both comedy and sorrow. Audiences who were not yet born when she lived watch her and feel the same pull that those in the 1950s felt, as though she were speaking directly to them across time. She has not aged, has not dimmed, for the camera captured her impermanence, while the world around her changed and passed away. In this way, she has become both eternal and unreachable, a presence fixed in youth, while the years flow on without her. Yet her legacy is not only cinematic, it is mythic. Marilyn Monroe is not merely the name of a woman, but the symbol of a paradox, the embodiment of beauty and fragility, of laughter and despair, of glamour and loneliness. To speak her name is to summon not only an actress, but an idea, an icon, a dream. She has been painted, photographed, imitated, analyzed, sung about, and written into countless stories. Her face, reproduced endlessly, has become as familiar as any saints in the iconography of modern culture. She's at once real and unreal, a woman and a myth woven inseparably together. The years after her death saw her image plastered upon posters, her likeness sold on postcards, her smile frozen on billboards. Yet even as commerce consumed her, reverence endured. Fans traveled from across the world to leave roses upon her grave at Westwood Memorial Cemetery, a modest plaque marking the resting place of a woman who had once been the most famous figure alive. The stone is small, but the flowers are abundant, their petals soft against the cool metal, renewed year after year, as though time itself bows before her memory. Those who visit often speak of a strange quiet there. The cemetery lies tucked away, its walls shielding it from the noise of Los Angeles, and among the graves, Marilyn's draws the most attention. Strangers pause, bow their heads, leave tokens of remembrance. A note, a photograph, a lipstick mark pressed against the stone. It is as though they feel not only grief for her, but kinship, as though her loneliness speaks to their own. For in her vulnerability they see themselves, in her longing they recognize their own hearts. She is not adored only for her beauty, but for the humanity that shimmered beneath it. Over time, her legacy has been shaped and reshaped by those who wrote of her. Some called her tragic, others foolish, others genius in her own way. Each interpretation reveals more about the speaker than about her, for Marilyn cannot be captured fully by words. She slips away from definitions, as she always did in life. To some, she is the ultimate victim of fame, destroyed by the machine that created her. To others, she is a rebel, seizing control of her career through her own production company, daring to demand respect in a world that dismissed women. To still others, she is a symbol of eternal femininity, an image both desired and pitied. All are true, and none are sufficient. Her legacy also lives in art. Painters and photographers return to her face again and again, finding in her features a kind of archetype. Andy Warhol's repetitions of her portrait transformed her into a symbol of both glamour and mass consumption, an image multiplied until it became almost abstract. Yet even in abstraction, her gaze remains magnetic, her lips still parted in that half-smile, her vulnerability shining through even in pop art's bright colors. She resists erasure, resists distortion, always returning as herself no matter how she is reimagined. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of her legacy is the mystery itself. Had she lived, perhaps she would have grown older, her fame softened, her myth diminished by the ordinariness of time. But she died young, and in dying young, she became eternal. Like James Dean, like other figures claimed too soon, she was frozen in her prime, her story left unfinished, her image never allowed to fade. The absence of resolution made her presence immortal. She became not only a memory but a question, and questions endure longer than answers. And so she lingers, in film reels, in photographs, in whispered stories, in the imagination of those who never met her. She lingers in the roses upon her grave, in the candle flames lit in her memory, in the way her name still carries a hush when spoken aloud. She lingers because she was never entirely known, and what is not known cannot die. The image of this legacy is of a poster fading upon a wall, its colors dulled by sun and time, yet still recognizable, still luminous. Below it lies a grave, marked simply, yet adorned with roses so fresh they seem to bloom anew each dawn. The poster and the grave, one fading, one renewed, together embody the paradox of her memory, both fading into history and continually reborn, both myth and woman entwined forever. The candle flame is lit beside the roses, burning slowly, casting its glow upon the plaque, its wax dripping as though time itself were dissolving. From this flame we move into the final meditation, into the epilogue of her story, where memory, beauty, and mortality converge, and where silence itself becomes the only true ending.